Quake was originally released in 1996 for MS-DOS and Windows, developed by id Software, the very same team that brought you Doom, Doom 2, and the Wolfenstein games before it. id Software are no strangers to the first-person shooter genre, as they basically revolutionized the first-person shooter genre. The Quake engine was the first true 3D game engine, featuring proper 3D models, fully 3D level design, as well as light maps. Quake is often considered to be one of the greatest video games. This is a great remaster, released originally in 2021 for the PlayStation, Xbox, Switch, and PC. I played this on a PlayStation 5, although I do have a lot of experience with the PS4 version. Granted, I don't have much experience with the original version of Quake, so I really can't provide a perspective on that. The Quake engine was developed by John Carmack, John Cash, and Michael Abrish, and served to be one of the most influential video game engines ever developed. There was a lot of controversies surrounding the development of Quake, as creative differences as well as lack of leadership caused most of the development team to leave id Software, including co-founder John Romero, shortly after the game's release. This remaster, originally released in 2001, features quality of life improvements such as the inclusion of a weapon wheel, as well as updated textures, including the new expansions, 2 of which were made by fans and 2 of which are official. And you can see the weapon wheel, which I believe Red Dead Redemption was the first game to have something like that, but the Doom games of recent years had those weapon wheels as well, so this isn't a true one-to-one remake of the original Quake. This is a remaster with some quality of life changes to modernize it a little bit. One of the biggest gameplay appeals of Quake is the extremely rapid movement. By default, you move very quickly, you can jump unusually high, and you can even use weapons in some instances to give you even additional maneuverability, at the cost of losing a bit of health. This also made Quake a very popular speedrunning game, as many of these movement techniques were implemented in single-level runs as well as full-game runs. This also meant that multiplayer for this game was very fast-paced, especially using the weapons assists such as rocket jumps. And of course, bunny hopping was born with Quake. We'll get into the maneuverability via weapons a little bit later. But when it comes to weapons in Quake, no first-person shooter game would ever be complete without the inclusion of some sort of a melee weapon. In Quake, originally the gun butt wanted to be used, but was changed to an axe after development. And there's a lot of great details with this axe. For example, if you hit an armored enemy, such as a knight, with the axe you'll hear a tink sound, which I think is very, very cool. The axe isn't particularly useful and is really only if you're in a bind, but it's a decent option for melee. The weapon you'll be using the most often in Quake, as well as the default starting weapon, is the shotgun. The shotgun is basically the weakest weapon in the game if you don't count melee. It's the weapon you'll start off with, and probably the weapon you'll be using the most is the variation of it, the double-barrel shotgun, which is essentially the Quake equivalent of the super shotgun from Doom 2. The super shotgun effectively doubles the amount of damage of the weapon, as you have 2 shots at once instead of 1. Of course, you do burn through ammo quicker, but you have so much shotgun ammo that it really doesn't matter. The weapon you'll be using the second most is most likely the nail gun. The nail gun has a very rapid rate of fire. It does a decent amount of damage and is very useful for crowd control. You can decimate the smaller enemies in seconds using the nail gun. But similarly to the shotgun, there is a second variation. The super nail gun, I believe is what it's called. And of course, these nail guns are a reference to 9-inch nails, but the idea of shooting nails out of a gun is pretty cool. You do have to be mindful of the ammo with this one too, because you can burn through your ammo very, very quickly. It's pretty important to use this gun sparingly though. It's very useful for crowd control. If there's a lot of enemies nearby, you can output a lot of damage fairly quickly, but you're going to burn through ammo, so it's most likely useful to just switch to the double-barreled shotgun and use that as much as you can. Getting into the heavier weapons now, we have the grenade launcher, which is great for decimating smaller enemies, but for some of the bigger enemies such as the Shambler, it's really great for adding it to splash damage, as you can pepper the grenades basically wherever you want. If you can directly hit an enemy, they will implode on contact, but this is mostly useful for crowd control, unless you want to try to maximize splash damage. You could also use this to give yourself a boost, but it's delayed. Next up, we have probably everybody's favorite weapon, the rocket launcher. The rocket launcher is very good for applying a lot of damage very quickly, but you have to be pretty mindful of where you're shooting the rocket launcher, because a lot of splash damage can hurt you just as much. But outside of applying a lot of damage very quickly, you can also use the rocket launcher to give yourself a big boost in terms of navigation. This is called rocket jumping. Rocket jumping can propel you to new heights and really assist you in navigation at the exchange of losing health. This allows you to reach areas that you otherwise wouldn't normally be able to. Finally, we get to the final weapon in the game, the Thunderbolt, the most powerful weapon as well as the most rare. The Thunderbolt shoots out pure electricity and does a very, very large amount of damage. However, you might want to be careful about using the weapon underwater. In terms of themes and imagery, Quake does lean into religion a bit more than Doom ever did, but this doesn't lean into hell and demons than Doom did. I think that this game is really interesting in terms of its setting and atmosphere. And once again, since it's id Software and they like to be all edgy and stuff for the 90s, this game does have quite a lot of religious imagery, and also there are hellish themes, I guess you could say. Outside of the single-player campaign, this remastered Quake also features the ability to play the multiplayer sections entirely offline with the use of bots. You can also change the difficulty of these bots, and honestly, this multiplayer gameplay is extremely fun. It kind of reminds me when I used to play the classic Quake on Steam all the time. Quake was always known and praised for having such a great multiplayer component, and I think it translated very nicely. This game supports up to 8 players at once, or you can do 1 player and then up to 7 bots. And it's fairly limited in terms of game mode. You have Deathmatch, which is basically free-for-all, Capture the Flag, Horde, and then Cooperative, which is basically when you and someone else, either online or local split screen, can play through the game's campaigns. Speaking of campaigns, this game does also feature the expansions. This remaster contains the 2 officially released expansions, Scourge of Armagon and Dissolution of Eternity, as well as 2 fan-made expansion packs that are being officially released for the first time. These expansions mostly feature longer levels and new enemies such as this robot Scorpion. And these levels are a lot tougher than the original game. It sort of seems like Final Doom to Doom 2. It's officially released expansion packs that are longer, contain more enemies, and overall are harder. But it's a nice challenge if you're a veteran Quake player. I do think it's fun putting a lot of smaller enemies together in a bunch like this. I am more of a fan of just the official game. The expansions were a nice inclusion, and honestly it wouldn't be a complete Quake experience without them. But I prefer the original expansions. But as I said, if you think Quake is too easy, then these are definitely for you. There are 2 new additions to this remaster in the form of expansions, Dimension of the Past and Dimension of the Machine. I must admit that Dimension of the Machine is absolutely my favorite of the 4, expansions included. This is some of the best looking Quake expansions you'll ever see, especially in a non-modded version of Quake. These levels are genuinely beautiful to look at. Overall, the Quake Remaster is absolutely spectacular and is the perfect way to introduce someone to Quake if they've never played it before. As a result, this is highly recommended.